Welcome to this edition of Inside the Academy Studio.
Today's conversation will be about James Marsh's The Theory of Everything. The Theory of Everything was adapted to screen by Anthony McCarten, and it's based on Jane Hawking's book. The film explores the relationship of Stephen and Jane Hawking through their meeting in Cambridge in 1963, to Stephen's diagnosis and battle with motor neuron disease, and his subsequent rise as a renowned physicist who explores black holes and the meaning and start of time. And it also takes us through the trials and tribulations of the Hawking family, told harrowingly through Jane's point of view. And I think that's a good point to start. This movie is based on Jane Hawking's autobiography. So it's not necessarily, hey, this is just a Stephen Hawking flick. This has a lot of influence by Jane. How does that help Marsh and company create Stephen Hawking and not really celebritize him or make him a celebrity before he needs to be?
Well, it helps in the fact that we get to see exactly who Stephen Hawking, the person, is. Both his obviously professionally, we see what exactly he's working on. This film does have pretty lengthy sequences where it just talks about the science and not even just the relationship between Jane and Stephen, but then of course it does talk about the relationship between Jane and Stephen and why they're initially drawn together and why Jane stood by his side through his initial health problems that continued on.
Yeah, and I think it demonstrates and it shows us the imperfections of Stephen Hawking, right? It's easy when somebody's so famous and so renowned to just think of them in one light. But here is a film that it's seen through Jane's struggle. So you kind of see that, sure, that there was physical inabilities for Stephen, but there was also emotional inabilities. And he kind of spaced out a lot of times in a relationship when Jane needed him, just not for caretaking for their kids, but just also emotionally as a couple. So I think that's why it's powerful to have this film based on Jane's experiences and her kind of telling them rather than simply Stephen Hawking's. Let's talk about those performances. Both are being recognized by the Academy this year. Jane Hawking, played by Felicity Jones, someone we've enjoyed since we saw her movie Like Crazy.
And Amazing Spider-Man 2.
But Black Widow, unfortunately, will not live in the cinematic universe.
Black Widow's in the Avengers.
Alright, sorry ScarJo. And Eddie Redmayne, someone some people will know from many things, probably Les Mis, the most popular. His transformation into Stephen Hawking. Let's talk about Redmayne first. Obviously, someone who's inflicted with motor neuron disease, you start to lose control over voluntary muscle actions. And the interesting thing I read while researching this film after watching it was how Redmayne was so particular in kind of mapping out when each muscle lost function. And that you might think is, alright, that's a little, being anal retentive, and that's kind of disingenuous or disnatural, but to me it seems like another sense of Redmayne inhabiting Stephen Hawking, because each muscle in your body or each function has such great importance in who you are, and him kind of linearly telling us his story just aids in the performance of, okay, he's showing a man who is functioning to someone who's now limited in many of the functions we take for granted. For Redmayne, that's a great commitment, and obviously most of the praise he's getting is well-deserved.
Yeah, and the movie being shot sequentially draws some parallels to another movie nominated for Best Picture. I'm not going to name which one. It definitely it's definitely able to add a lot to the performance, and it's just so believable. And it was a great piece another great piece of IMDb trivia that Stephen Hawking thought he was looking at himself watching this movie. So, and even by the end, where initially they planned, okay, maybe Stephen Hawking can make an appearance of himself, I don't think the movie lost anything having Eddie Redmayne play him at the end. I think a lot of audience members who may know nothing of Stephen Hawking outside of maybe an appearance on The Simpsons maybe thought Stephen Hawking was playing himself the entire movie, to be honest. So it was a very convincing performance, as we've mentioned.
And I don't think there's a bigger compliment when the person you're portraying says you've done a great job. A lot of the film for Redmayne is about the physicality and the physical transformation, but it's how he portrays it when he does lose things. Like, okay, he battles pneumonia. He has to get tracheotomy. He loses basically the ability to speak, even the limited speech he had before. And he's kind of, goes to the famous speech to text to speech computer that many of the audience knows him for now. But the portrayal and the use of his eyes, they say when you're portraying emotion, the eyes are the window into your soul, and it couldn't be truer in this sense. A lot of the sadness that Redmayne and Hawking felt, whether it be where he was physically, he felt he wasn't the person he was or wanted to be, after surviving so long, what else could he take? But also the kind of the dissolution of his relationship with Jane and how he portrayed that through his eyes. I do want to talk about Felicity Jones. Slate wrote an interesting piece about how a lot of movies this year, the actors or the female actors simply played reactresses, so people who reacted to the concerns of their leading men or the troubles of their leading men. They particularly pointed out Keira Knightley in Imitation Game, Sienna Miller in both Foxcatcher and American Sniper, and I guess to some extent Felicity Jones here. Is there any credence to being a reactress, or because Jane really was the touchstone of this family? Many ways she had to react to Stephen, because otherwise their family wouldn't function if she didn't kind of know where he needed or what needs he needed.
Yeah, I don't really see how that applies in this, and I think could be the complete opposite, because she's really the catalyst for what you see in this movie. If she didn't stay with Stephen throughout his diagnosis and commit to marrying him, then we don't get Stephen Hawking as and the life that he lived after. So, yes, of course, Stephen Hawking deserves all the credit for developing these theories that are still, of course, have impacted physics greatly. But it was because of his relationship with his wife that he was able to do a lot of these things, and is really, in some weird way, you could say Stephen Hawking was reacting off of Jane Hawking in this movie.
Yeah, he drew a lot of great strength from Jane, and obviously that may be the most important scene in the film, is when Jane, who's just learned about the diagnosis and the 2 years to live, kind of lays it out bare, says, I'm going to fight, I'm in it, I don't care, and that's sometimes power of will is very important. He's very lucky. It wasn't, I guess, specifically designed as the truest form of ALS, but it was obviously debilitating. So, the fact that he's lived for 40 years, a great deal, it's because of Jane and those early years of putting him through, like helping him through getting his PhD, sacrificing your own PhD because of it, and helping him kind of continue with the theory of time and where everything began. One of the other elements recognized by the Academy from the theory of everything is the beautiful original score by Johan Johansson. And I think the beauty of this score is the fact that it's understated, but it also illuminates. A lot of the theories of physics in this film deal with cosmology, with the eons, with space, and the sense of wonder. And I think that's what the score tries to achieve. And it kind of helps. This is... Sure, seems like seemingly perfect moments between Jane and Stephen, but even the tougher times, I feel the score is just a great assistance to what's happening on screen.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it helps get into both characters' perspectives. I mean, there's scenes where... especially there's a scene near the end where you do see the time travel in the entire movie replayed and back, and this And it's a combination of the score that you heard before, and then you hear it again at the end, like that in that sequence. It really hits the message that the movie wants to send, and it's just a great shot sequence, I thought.
Okay, we're almost ending the end of this episode of Inside the Academy Studio, and like always, we like to end with certain questions. So, I'm going to take it first. What was my favorite moment in The Theory of Everything? And it has to be the initial dinner scene between Jonathan, who eventually becomes Jane's second husband and is the caretaker to the kids often, with Stephen and Jane in their house. And Jonathan's trying to understand what Stephen does. And it's Jane who kind of takes charge and kind of explains what Stephen's ethos is, what his thesis is, and to the great pride, I think, of Stephen Hawking, or at least portrayed by Eddie Redmayne, he feels great pride that Jane knows so much about his work that she can tell a convincing dinner story to Jonathan without skipping a beat. So that was obviously my favorite moment. How about yours?
I think my favorite moment is how I really thought that how Stephen and Jane eventually do decide to split up and eventually divorce. I thought the culmination leading up to that point was handled really well. And it showed that this wasn't just a movie about a love story about two people sticking together through hard times. How it was also a story about how two people can grow apart over time, no matter what situation you're put in, and no matter how much love you have for each other, that you were able to stick through insurmountable odds. And it was a really well done scene, and it was really believable that eventually they would get divorced, and then by the end of the movie have a professional relationship still. So a really interesting dynamic about relationships that you wouldn't expect from a movie that was kind of marketed as a love story against all odds at first. So a story about love in general, not just a love story.
Okay, moving on. My least favorite moment in The Theory of Everything is probably the integration of Stephen's family later on in the film. We haven't seen them for a long time. Then we see them at that family picnic after the birth of their second child, and it just seems they seem to be intrusive when we haven't seen it. Maybe that's a part of cuts have to be made, and that was the reality, but to me, it kind of seemed like, oh, okay, you guys, we saw so much of them early on, but then we missed them, and it kind of seemed like it rang disingenuous that they had so much feelings or thoughts about that relationship at that time.
And my least favorite part of the movie is a little bit more abstract. It's kind of the beginning of the movie, where the music was really loud, but you couldn't really hear the words the actors were saying. So it felt like I was kind of missing that beginning of the meeting between Jane and Stephen. So it kind of felt like I missed a chunk of the movie, and I felt like those scenes could have been done better. At least audio-wise, definitely.
Okay. The last thing we do is word association. So, when you think of The Theory of Everything, what word do you think of?
God.
God, and I think of Cambridge. Obviously, that's where Stephen became famous for his physics and where the two met. So when we think of The Theory of Everything, we think of God and Cambridge. That has been this edition of Inside the Academy Studio.
Thank you.